Hey guys, my name is Børge Wiik and I work as a software developer in Sopra here in Oslo. I mainly work with .NET, but also with infrastructure in Azure. And so the last year I've been working with Azure Template Specs, and not a lot of people have heard of it or used it because it's fairly new. It came out of preview this year, so I thought it would be fun to do a talk about it. And to set the context a little bit, say you want to deploy your app or a website to Azure, and in the beginning it's easy to just fire up an app service yourself manually and run your code on it. But eventually you might want to extend with a database or a virtual network, and maybe several environments for this. And yeah, now you've got yourself a system, an IT system, and it's going to be hard to maintain. So how do you do that? And there are a bunch of tools to do it, and today we're going to see how you can use Azure Template Specs to do it. So here's the overall agenda. We're going to lay a foundation with looking at infrastructure as code. We're going to touch in on ARM templates, and then, of course, template specs. So, infrastructure as code, what is that? And what is infrastructure? I like to use this city analogy to explain it, because in a city you have roads and bridges to move people or goods. And in the same way, in an IT system, you have queues or service bus to move data. So just like for a city, in an IT system, you need infrastructure for it to function. So in this new agile world, we need to be able to respond fast to code changes, but that applies to infrastructure as well. So there's been this unification of the process between infrastructure and application code. Now, infrastructure as well is part of the code base. So, there are a bunch of tools to help you with this. ARM templates is one of them, and ARM templates is Azure's way of doing infrastructure as code. On the right here, we have an example of an ARM template. It's just a JSON file, and it defines your infrastructure and your configuration. And you can deploy it in a bunch of ways. You can do it manually in the portal, or you can use PowerShell or Azure CLI, anything. So yeah, I can't really talk about ARM templates nowadays without mentioning Bicep. And yeah, it can't be a coincidence that they called it Bicep when it's dealing with ARM templates. It's a language developed to be simpler than ARM templates, because humans aren't really meant to work with JSON. That's just horrible. So they came up with this a language that is simpler, Bicep, and it's an abstraction over ARM templates. So when you deploy it, it's going to convert down to an ARM template file. And with this new Bicep language, I think Microsoft might be in a better position to compete with other infrastructure as code toolings like Terraform or Pulumi. So yeah, here they are side by side, and I think we can agree that Bicep looks a lot better than ARM templates. Not a lot of those squiggly brackets and symbols and all that stuff. It looks a lot simpler, and the IntelliSense as well is really good in Bicep. So yeah, a lot better to work with. So when you work with these kind of files, you ensure that your deployments are repeatable. They're idempotent. You can deploy the ARM template or Bicep file over and over again, and you're going to get the same results. And yeah, you know what you expect. So that's good. But yeah, there are some limitations as well with ARM templates. Maybe you've worked with ARM templates. Maybe you hate it, and I would understand you. Because it's not only is it JSON, but it's also hard to share with your team. And I'll give you an example. Say you have an ARM template, you want to deploy it, and you have to store it somewhere, maybe a repository, most likely. to do that, to do the deployment from there, you're going to have to reference your ARM template either through a public URL, meaning your repository has to be public, and that's not something you might want, or you need a URL with a token, and that might also not be something you want to deal with. So to get around this limitation, people have been downloading their own local copies of the ARM templates and deploying them manually. And what happens when people start working with their local copies? Code start to diverge, and eventually you'll end up with something completely different than your original file. So that's not good. But luckily, template specs come to the rescue. And yeah, what is template specs anyways? It's just a resource type in Azure that stores your ARM templates. And we'll see what that means. Here's the overall process. You take your ARM templates, you create a template spec off of them, and then it's this template spec resource that you now deploy. So, yeah, why should you bother using template specs when you already have ARM templates? Well, they're made to make your templates more easy to share with your team. You can create your ARM templates, create a template spec off of it, ensure they follow your company regulations, and then it's this template spec you give to your team, and they don't have to deal with the JSON anymore. They can just deploy this template spec file resource, which is way easier to deal with. And since it's a resource in Azure now, you also get role-based access control. You can ensure only the guys with the correct permissions are allowed to see this file and deploy it. So that's really good. And that also takes care of the URL with the token thing. You don't have to deal with that anymore. You have RBAC. So yeah. And then it's this versioning. That's also really nice. You create your template spec file, give it a version. When you might want to apply some changes later, so you do those, and then you give it a new version, and you get the versioning history right there in Azure. That's really nice. But how does this actually work? I've created a demo. I've cheated. I've pre-recorded it. This way, no demo ghosts from me. Also, it's going to force me to stay on time, because we don't have a lot of that. So we're going to see how we can deploy a web app to Azure using Bicep and template specs. So I think this video is going to start by itself. Yes. Here we have a Bicep file. We can see an app service and an app service plan that we need for building. Yeah, and it looks pretty simple. We got parameters, variables, and resources. Pretty intuitive compared to ARM templates. And for comparison, here's the ARM template that the Bicep file is going to convert to when we deploy it. And yeah, it looks a lot bigger, a lot of nasty stuff in there. So luckily, we don't have to deal with that. And we're going to use PowerShell to deploy this. So here's the PowerShell script. I'm going to run it in the Windows terminal, but this can, of course, be run from a pipeline if we want. So yeah, to save time running it here, and I'll go into the details of the file. So the first thing we have to do, besides the authentication stuff, we need a resource group. And this is where we'll keep the template spec and also our web app in this case. They can, of course, be in different resource groups, but yeah. So when we have the resource group, we can run the new IaC template spec command, which creates our template spec. And as you can see, I'm feeding it the Bicep file, and I'm also giving a version. And so when the template spec is created, we can retrieve the ID of the template spec and run a resource group deployment at the end here. So yeah, just 3-4 commands, and we can deploy our infrastructure. So yeah, we can see that things have start to happen in the terminal here. So if we go into Azure, we can find the resource group we just created. And since I pre-recorded it, I know it's there. So here it is. And we can see that we have our resources in there, the web app, the app service plan, and of course the template spec that we used to deploy this. So if we go into the template spec, we can see that it's just a resource like anything else in Azure. And we got this main template thing here. We might recognize it as the ARM template we saw in VS Code earlier. So the bicep file has been decompiled like we expect. And of course you have versioning and access control. So yeah, this is what it looks like when you use bicep and template specs to deploy Azure resources. All right. To summarize, we've seen what infrastructure as code is. We've seen that ARM templates is the way of dealing with it in Azure, but it has some limitations, but they're addressed by Azure Template Specs. Okay, thank you very much.